Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a subject that's, well, it's incredibly complex, very sensitive, and honestly highly stigmatized. We're talking about human sexual attraction to and activity with animals. Yeah, this really sits at a difficult intersection, doesn't it? Psychology, law, ethics, it's all tangled up. So our mission for you listening is to use the sources we've gathered to bring some real clinical precision and clarity here. We want to look past the stigma and understand the motivations, the prevalence, the clinical view, and the treatment approaches.
Absolutely. And to do that effectively, we have to start with the words themselves. The terminology is critical because these terms get misused all the time, but they have very specific meanings, legally and clinically. So first up, bestiality. This is purely about the act. It's a behavioral term. It means sexual contact happened between a human and an animal. It describes a behavior, often, a criminal act. Then there's zoophilia. This is different. It's a psychological term. It refers to a persistent sexual or even romantic attraction towards animals. Now, some individuals experiencing this might frame it as loving relationship, but ethically, that's just not tenable because of consent. We have to be clear on that. And finally, the broader clinical category is paraphilia. This is the psychiatric term for any intense, persistent sexual interest that's directed towards something other than sort of the standard, phenotypically normal, consenting adult human partner. Framing it this way, let's clinicians study the attraction itself, whether or not someone acts on it.
Okay, that's a really important baseline. So let's get to the most basic question first. Is this real? Do people actually experience this attraction or engage in these acts? Or is it just some kind of historical footnote?
Oh, it's unequivocally real. The sources leave no doubt about that. And it's definitely not new. Its presence is confirmed right throughout human history. You find depictions in really ancient mythology. I mean, think about Zeus and his transformations, and quite tellingly, you find it mentioned in very early legal codes. The fact that ancient societies needed to explicitly forbid bestiality tells you it was happening.
Right, you wouldn't ban something that didn't exist. And this brings us to something pretty startling from our sources, actually. It comes from the Kinsey reports back in 1948 and 1953. They weren't specifically studying this, but the data they collected on it is, well, it's eye-opening. Kinsey's team found that around 8% of the U.S. males they surveyed and about 3 to 4% of females reported having at least one sexual experience with an animal leading to orgasm, usually during adolescence. 8%. That seems incredibly high compared to what most people might assume.
It is a surprisingly high figure. And when you dig into that data a bit more, the role of sheer opportunity becomes really clear. For males who grew up on farms, specifically, that number jumps significantly up to 17%.
17%?
Yeah. It strongly suggests that for many, at least historically, the situational context, simply being around animals frequently, was a major factor, maybe an entry point.
But okay, that Kinsey data is, what, 70 years old now? How much does it reflect reality today? Have things changed?
That's the right question to ask. And yes, modern surveys do point to lower lifetime rates, more in the range of, say, 1 to 5% for men, maybe 1 to 2% for women. Researchers generally think this likely decline is down to some massive societal shifts. Think about mass urbanization. Fewer people live on farms, so the simple opportunity decreased. Stigma probably increased too, became more overt maybe. And crucially, the rise of the internet and readily available human pornography offered, well, alternative outlets for sexual expression that didn't carry the same risks.
That's interesting, though, the link to the internet, because the sources also suggest that while the behavior might have decreased, the internet actually gave the attraction a new kind of space.
Exactly. Online communities became really significant for individuals with these interests. It allowed them to connect with others, which reduced feelings of profound isolation. And in some cases, it helped them reframe their feelings, seeing it more as a kind of orientation rather than, say, a disorder or something shameful.
Which leads us directly into the really complex part, the why. If it's not just about opportunity, especially for those with a persistent attraction, what are the underlying motivations? The sources show it's definitely not just one thing.
No, it's rarely a single cause. It's usually multifaceted. We can sort of break it down into categories, but remember, these often overlap and interact. The first one we already touched on, situational opportunity. Like the Kinsey data showed, especially for adolescents in rural areas, it can be transient, maybe an outlet until human partners are available. But then you get into the deeper drivers, the emotional attachment factors. And this seems really key according to the research. Many people who identify as zoophiles report significant issues with intimacy, maybe deep loneliness, social anxiety, or a real difficulty forming secure attachments with other humans.
So the thinking is they turn towards animals because they perceive them as
what?
Non-judgmental, safe.
Precisely that. The animal is often seen as inherently accepting, loyal, safe. There's this perception of non-judgmental affection, which can be incredibly appealing if human relationships feel threatening or difficult. This desire can then drive the behavior and sometimes leads the person to rationalize it, to see the animal as a willing, loving partner.
And how does that relate to what the sources call the specific paraphilic interest, the kind of enduring core orientation idea? Where does that come from?
Right, the more ingrained pattern. This is thought to involve a mix of things, possibly neurobiological factors, maybe atypical brain function related to arousal or inhibition and developmental factors like conditioning. Think about early experiences, maybe even accidental ones, involving animals during a critical developmental period that could create these conditioned arousal templates. These pathways get sort of hardwired, and often underpinning this is that psychosocial piece we mentioned. Difficulties with human connection, whether it's extreme shyness, social phobia, maybe past trauma. If trusting humans feels impossible, seeking that connection with an animal, perceived as unconditionally accepting, can seem like a solution, however problematic.
It's important to see that distinction, the difference between seeking emotional solace and having that specific paraphilic wiring.
We should also briefly mention the other, less common motivations noted in the sources. Things like simple curiosity, sometimes coercion or abuse dynamics, or very rarely it might be a symptom of a severe underlying mental disorder like psychosis or a profound intellectual disability. But the dominant theme seems to be that breakdown in human attachment creating an emotional vacuum.
Okay, that gives us a much clearer picture of the why. Let's shift now to the clinical perspective. This is a crucial question for you listening. Is zoophilia itself classified as a disease, as a mental disorder?
This is where the main diagnostic manual, the DSM-5-TR, provides a really important distinction. Zoophilia is listed, but it's listed as a paraphilia, which basically means an intense sexual interest. It's not automatically considered a disorder. It only becomes diagnosed as a paraphilic disorder, specifically with the zoophilia specifier under two conditions. Either the persistent interest causes the person clinically significant distress like intense guilt, shame, anxiety, or serious impairment in their daily life. Clinicians call this being ego-dystonic, meaning the feelings themselves are unwanted and cause suffering.
Okay, so distress, or what's the second condition?
Or the second condition is if the individual has acted on these urges with a non-consenting animal. The harm caused to the animal by the act itself is the other pathway to a diagnosis.
Right, so the key takeaway here for you is that just having the persistent attraction isn't enough on its own to meet the criteria for a mental disorder according to the DSM. It's the distress it causes the person, or the harm caused by acting on it.
Exactly. And the International Classification System, the ICD-11, takes a pretty similar stance, focusing on distress or harm to well-being.
Okay, I need to jump in here though. If one path to diagnosis is harm to the animal, and any sexual act with an animal is inherently harmful because they can't consent, why does the clinical definition still give so much weight to the human's distress? The ego-dystonic part, doesn't that seem unbalanced given the victim is always the animal?
That's a really critical point, and it highlights attention. The DSM is fundamentally a tool for diagnosing and treating human mental health conditions. Its primary lens is on alleviating human suffering and dysfunction. So the distress criterion fits that model. However, the moment the act of bestiality occurs, you're right, the focus shifts dramatically. The legal and ethical frameworks completely take precedence, regardless of the DSM diagnosis or the person's internal distress levels. And that brings us squarely to the ethical and legal reality, which is paramount here. No matter how someone feels internally or whether they meet DSM criteria for a disorder, the act itself, bestiality, is illegal almost everywhere. The absolute core issue is the animal's inability to provide informed consent. Our sources are crystal clear on this. Because an animal cannot understand, cannot consent, any sexual act is inherently exploitative. Legally and ethically, it's defined as animal abuse. And sadly, it frequently does result in real physical injury, pain, or significant psychological trauma for the animal involved.
Okay, so given that absolute ethical line and the legal prohibitions, let's talk about intervention. When is treatment actually indicated?
Treatment is typically recommended only when the attraction is causing that significant ego-dystonic distress. We talked about the person is suffering because of these unwanted feelings, or when there's a clear risk of harm to animals, meaning the person might act on their urges. The goal isn't usually to cure or eliminate the orientation itself, but rather to manage the distress and, crucially, prevent any harmful behavior.
And what does that treatment look like according to the sources?
Psychotherapy is really the main approach. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, is used a lot. It specifically targets those cognitive distortions, the flawed thinking patterns like the animal enjoys this or this is a real relationship. CBT works on restructuring those thoughts and helping the person develop healthier coping mechanisms that don't involve harming animals. Another approach mentioned is acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT. This takes a slightly different angle. It helps the individual learn to accept the presence of the unwanted thoughts and urges without necessarily trying to eliminate them, but while staying strongly committed to their core values, especially the value of not causing harm.
So therapy is primary. Is medication ever part of the picture?
Yes, medication can be used, usually as an adjunct to therapy, not typically on its own. It's considered when the sexual urges are particularly intense, intrusive, and pose a high risk of leading to harmful actions. Often, standard antidepressants, the SSRIs like Prozac or Zoloft, might be used. They can have a side effect of lowering overall libido and reducing the intensity of obsessive thoughts or fantasies, which can make impulse control easier for the person. In more severe cases where the risk of reoffending committing acts of bestiality is considered very high and therapy alone isn't sufficient, clinicians might consider much stronger medications like antiandrogens. These drugs work by reducing testosterone levels, which can drastically lower the sex drive. But that's generally reserved for high-risk situations.
That sounds like a very significant intervention using antiandrogens.
It absolutely is. It really underscores the seriousness with which the potential harm to animals is viewed. When the risk to a non-consenting victim is that high, such drastic measures for managing impulse control can become part of the clinical discussion.
And what about strategies for people who perhaps acknowledge the attraction but are committed to not acting on it? Harm reduction approaches.
Yes, that's important too. For individuals who aren't necessarily seeking to change their orientation, but are firmly committed to ethical boundaries and preventing harm, the focus shifts to management and harm reduction. This involves practical things: developing really robust relapse prevention plans, learning to identify and proactively avoid situations or triggers that might increase the risk of acting out, and importantly, finding healthy, non-sexual ways to channel their affection for animals, maybe through dedicated volunteer work in an animal shelter, ethical pet ownership, or responsible animal husbandry, focusing entirely on care and well-being.
This has been incredibly useful, I think, in bringing some much-needed clarity to a really difficult topic. So just to recap the essential takeaways for you from our sources: that critical distinction between zoophilia, the attraction, and bestiality, the act; the frankly surprising historical prevalence data from Kinsey; and that key clinical point: the attraction itself isn't a disorder unless it causes significant distress to the person or leads to harm.
Exactly. And if you pull back to see the bigger picture here, you really see that inherent tension we discussed. The clinical framework, the DSM, is largely focused on addressing the human's distress or dysfunction. But the ethical and legal systems, they are, quite rightly, focused almost entirely on preventing the exploitation and abuse of the non-consenting animal. These two systems operate on different priorities and often only intersect when an actual act of harm occurs.
Absolutely. And that connection the research repeatedly draws between difficulties in human attachment and seeking solace, emotional or sexual. With animals, it really leaves us with a provocative thought, doesn't it? If we know that this emotional deficit, the loneliness, the anxiety, maybe past trauma, is often a significant root cause, it raises a really important question for you to think about. In our efforts to prevent animal abuse and manage these paraphilias, how much focus should society also place on understanding and, crucially, addressing those underlying psychosocial factors, the things that might lead someone down that path in the first place? That's definitely something worth considering.